Hi guys, Level Up here with another Division video. Today's video was going to be about building DeadEYE in the new upcoming 1.7 patch. But as I was going through, I realised that a lot of the things I was thinking about and wanted to cover do still apply in 1.6. And given the fairly recent changes to the way crit damage is calculated, it might not always be obvious what's the best in slot to go for. So what I wanted to do is go into a bit of detail about how damage is calculated and the effects of changing certain amounts of crit damage on your overall damage output. Because I think it's a bit of a misconception that when you're building for DeadEYE, it's all about crit damage, when in reality, once you get to a certain point, crit damage kind of doesn't give you that much of an increase, kind of diminishing returns once you get to a certain level. So to start with, let's take a look at how damage is calculated in the game. So we have base damage multiplied by other damage sources multiplied by a single crit and headshot bonus. So what this means is we have our base damage, which is weapon damage plus the gloves bonus multiplied by the all weapons damage bonus. And that's the bonus. That's the overall damage that you're going to see when you go to your weapon in your inventory. This is what it's going to show. It's going to show the base damage plus whatever the gloves bonus is, multiplied by the all weapons damage bonus, which is things like Reckless, the Alpha Bridge 3-piece bonus, Skull's motorcycle gloves. And then other damage sources include enemy armor damage, damage to elites, and out of cover damage, and these are all multiplicative together. So if we're looking at PvE, then stacking EAD and damage to elites is going to massively increase your overall damage output to those sorts of enemies. It doesn't apply to all of them. And then finally we have the crit and headshot bonus, which is now one single factor effectively, which is 1 plus your crit damage bonus percentage plus your headshot damage percentage. So previously it was calculated separately with headshot damage, so you would have two separate multipliers for crit and headshot, and that would allow you to get some ridiculous crit headshots. So that was back in the day of 1.3 when we'd get like easy 2.5 million headshot crits. So what it means now is that since crits become additive, it's a lot less effective than a raw damage increase. And the more crit that you stack, the more crit damage that you stack, the less effective it becomes. So it's worth looking into the detail of the numbers to see what effect this is going to have. So if we take the example of an M700 carbon, if we look at this table, I know it's a bit of a lot of data, but let's look at it in column by column. The first column is what we're going to take as the baseline. So we're looking at a base damage of 120,000, we've got gloves damage, we've got reckless, and then we've got every possible source of crit damage. So that takes us to a total of 156% crit damage. What that gives us is a total damage output of 344,000. So as we move to the right, I'm changing one factor at a time. So if we take off Reckless, what effect does that have? If we do take off Reckless, it reduces our total damage output by 7.4%. You might be wondering why it's not 8%, and that's just the way I've calculated it. It's an 8% increase on 319,000, but a 7.4% decrease on 344,000. So if we compare that change to, say, taking off the crit damage on the backpack and knee pads, so that's a reduction of 18% in total crit damage. But if we keep Reckless on this time, then we can see that it has a 7% reduction. So it's actually slightly better than having crit damage on backpack and knee pads and not having Reckless. But then if we take that example, what are we losing by not having crit damage on the backpack and knee pads? We're losing possibly 30,000 health. So if I take that and kind of do some calculations on the overall toughness, it actually works out better to have Reckless with the minus 10% all damage resistance, but have that extra 30,000 health. You end up with about 5% more toughness that way. So it's definitely better to have Reckless, if you had to choose between them anyway, and to keep the health on the knee pads and the backpack, because you're not getting enough damage to justify the amount of toughness that you're losing. So that's certainly something to consider. The next thing to consider when you're building for DeadEYE is what impact is it going to have if you don't have a specific attribute on your gloves. Now, it's not always possible to get both crit damage and MMR damage on your gloves, so I wanted to have a look to see what the effect is if you can only choose one. So on the M700, because it's got a high base damage, it's got a high per bullet damage, and because gloves damage is it's not a percent increase, it's an absolute increase. So by adding, or by not having MMR damage on your gloves, you're effectively reducing your total damage output by 3.8%. And if we move to the column on the right, we're keeping the gloves damage, but we're taking off the crit damage from the gloves, and you can see that drops the overall damage by 6.6%. So in the case of the M700, it's a lot better to have crit damage than it is to have your weapon damage on your gloves. So that's another thing to think about. Obviously the best case scenario is to have both, but if you're only able to choose one, then definitely go with crit damage if you're using a bolt action. If you're using a lower base damage, higher rate of fire MMR like the SVD, this table here is exactly the same in every other column. It's just that it's here to show that when you remove the base damage from your gloves, so the weapon damage from your gloves, it has a much bigger impact because the overall base damage on the SVD is lower. So you can see that in this particular case you lose 7.3% damage by not having MMR damage on your gloves, and you'd only lose 6.6% if you took off the crit damage. So if you're going for a purely high rate of fire or SVD DeadEYE build, then actually it's better to have weapon damage on your gloves, but you're going to want to have both if you can. So that's kind of the theory I just wanted to cover, because it's not always obvious, and certainly things like when I was building originally I was wondering whether it was worth having crit damage on my backpack and knee pads, and I think in this case it shows that it's not worth it. If you had to choose, or if you want to build a kind of a balance between toughness and damage output, then you're definitely better off with Reckless. But if you're going full glass cannon, then have crit on both your backpack and the knee pads, but you will be unbelievably squishy. You'll have absolutely no toughness whatsoever. But that's the trade-off. So if I now show you my build that I have for PvE. Okay, so this is the DeadEYE build that I currently use for all challenging PvE missions. It's focused around high firearms, just enough stamina to unlock destructive, and no electronics, no skill power, no skill haste. The primary weapon I'm using is an M700 Carbon, which has the highest base damage that I could find. I think this is pretty much top. I've got one with like 1k more, but it has worse talents. I think this is pretty high. And it's got destructive, deadly and elevated. So I think destructive and deadly are the two key ones that you want for PvE. If this was for challenging, which it is generally, you're probably better off obviously with something like ferocious in the third slot, but that does it does require that you pick the gun up or roll it straight off with Destructive and Deadly, which is really unlikely, because then you'd have to re-roll the free one elevated for Ferocious. And that would be a little bit better, because obviously it just guarantees you 10% extra damage against all elites and named enemies. But I think elevated is quite useful. It's not that hard to be more than 1.2 meters above your target, so it does proc quite often, and it is quite strong when it does. For the weapon mods, all of the ones I use are extended magazine, C79 scope, and whatever muzzle and grip I can get that's got 19% crit damage on. So that's what I have on both weapons. My secondary is an SVD. It's one that I crafted. This is the highest base damage I could get. It's pretty high, and again, Destructive and Deadly. It does still have the standard SVD talent, Disciplined, which isn't much use, obviously, because the talent is killing a target will make your next shot with a weapon an automatic critical hit. But with DeadEYE, then every single shot's a critical hit anyway. However, in 1.7, that's not always going to be the case, because whenever you're out of cover, you only get 60% critical hit chance. So this might at least make it a little bit better. If you're out of cover after you killed an enemy, at least it does mean that your next shot will still be a crit, so not completely useless. Going on to the gear, so I'm running, all of the mods I'm running are all Damage to Elites purple mods. I did stupidly forget to buy the good stamina ones that were on sale last week, that were I think 209 stamina and 4% damage to elites. So these ones are all firearms ones with 3% damage to elites. And all of my performance mods are pulse critical hit damage. But going into the vest, so this is a Reckless. I think it's the best one to use. It's 8% extra damage is hard to replace really in this kind of high DPS build. And I'm running it with health and enemy armor damage, which I think is what you want for PvE really. Onto my mask, another high firearms and enemy armor damage and damage to elites. Again, for PvE, those are the ones you want to choose. Onto the knee pads. This is the weakest one in the set. I'm using. It's got a very low armor roll. It's got a very high stamina roll though, which I did roll onto it. And as you can see, it's just enough to unlock Destructive, which is the only reason I'm using it. It's got a mediocre health roll and a fairly low damage to elites roll as well. Ideally, I'd want to use something like this, which has got pretty high armor, pretty much. I'm not sure what the maximum is for the knee pads, but I'm pretty sure that's close. It's got 9% crit damage to elites, but it's got a really low stamina roll, unfortunately. And if I did use those, it wouldn't be enough to unlock Destructive, so unfortunately I have to use these ones. The backpack I'm using is a DeadEYE backpack. I will show you the difference between using this setup and a one where it's a specialised backpack and a DeadEYE holster instead. But I'm using this because I just have to have nimble. I think it's still the most powerful of the high ends really. It's because this build is such low skill power and low skill haste, you're never really getting any heals from your skills anyway. So having nimble is by far the best way to get your healing. So for that reason I'm using the DeadEYE backpack with firearms roll, reasonable armor roll, crit damage and bleed resistance. Bleed resistance is really useful, especially in some of the missions like Russian Consulate where you're getting spammed with seeker mines. It's quite useful that you're not bleeding for too long, so I'd probably recommend bleed resistance in PvE. It's also really useful in Legendary, obviously, as they often put bleed on you from their assault rifles. Moving on to the gloves, pretty much the best gloves really in terms of the attributes. So high firearms, it's got MMR damage, crit damage and enemy armor damage. Those are the three that you really want for PvE. It could be slightly higher, could get an extra 2% crit damage and probably about 500 to 600 more MMR damage, but it's still pretty good. And then onto the holster, which is a nimble holster with almost max firearms and pretty decent rest of the stats with health. So that's the main build I use, and like I say, nimble for me is the key. It's just when you're in a sticky situation and you've got no other way to heal, it does often really help to keep you alive. If I show you the difference, if I was to have a specialised backpack, which is on this one here, you can see that the skill power goes up from roughly 84.5 to 107. So it's about like 23,000 extra, and that looks like a lot. But if we were looking at the difference that it really makes to the skills, if we look at the pulse I get currently with only 84,500, it gives me 16% extra crit damage, and my booster shot is about 37,000. If I switch now to the specialised backpack, you can see that my pulse crit hit damage only goes up to 19, so it's only 3% extra, which doesn't really do a lot, really. In reality, it's, when you're already running like 145% crit damage, an extra 3% isn't going to make an awful lot of difference. For the booster shot, it does make quite a big difference. So it goes from 37 to 50,000, so an extra 13,000. But again, because the cooldown's still really, really long, and it's still not a great deal of difference. It probably means about a bar and a half of health. It's just not worth running it. You're just better off running with nimble instead, because you're just going to get, and doing a cover-to-cover move of like 3 meters will give you that extra health that you're going to be missing by not running, or by running specialised. So that's why I think it's best to run that combination. Looking at the talents, I always run critical save just because it's one of my go-to ones, really. It's always good to have that extra health, that extra damage resistance at low health when you need it the most. I generally always run tactical advance on DPS builds. It's good in conjunction with nimble, obviously, because you can do a cover-to-cover move. You get your health back and you get a damage increase as well. Steady hands, when you're using something like an SVD, when you want to get as many shots off in quick succession as possible, this is really useful because you just get a nice big 25% accuracy and stability gain. And finally, I switch between tech support. So tech support I will run if I'm running a challenge mode mission, because you're going to get more kills, and it means that you can keep your pulse and booster shot damage bonuses active for longer, and that's really useful. If I'm running a legendary, I'll change to evasive action, because you're going to be doing more cover-to-cover moves, and it's very helpful to have that damage reduction during that move, and when you get to your destination you obviously get your heal from nimble. So I think those are probably the best ones to use. I don't use precision because I'm already running pulse, and because I'm not going for headshots. And for that same reason, not going for headshots, that's why I don't use one as none either. So that's the build really. I think it's pretty strong for PvE. I think there are other builds that are probably stronger, but if you're building a DeadEye build, I think this is the way to go about it. If you're building for PvP, it's a very different thing. So first of all, you would not run destructive because it just doesn't have enough of an impact against a player. So you'd run probably deadly, competent, and something like prepared. or yeah, I don't know, probably prepared. I can't think of anything better. There might be a better one, but what you want to focus on is competent, and you want to focus on skill haste. So everywhere that you're currently running enemy armor damage, so vest and gloves for certain, you'd change enemy armor damage to skill haste, and you might want to put skill haste mods on. The point being that you just want to maximize the uptime of competent. So you want your skills to come back as quickly as possible so that you can use them. You get your native damage boost from booster shot, plus you get the 10% from competent, and that's going to be the best way to maximise the damage that you deal against other players. I still think you'd run, you still probably want to run nimble over specialised, but it's a personal choice. I just like it. I think it's always good to have that constant heal coming in from nimble. So yeah, that's it really. I'm not going to show gameplay in this video. I am going to link to some gameplay I did with this exact build from the end screen, so you can go and have a look if you want. So I did a solo run of Lexington, Hudson refugee camp and Russian consulate using this build, so you can kind of see how it works. You can see the strengths and you can see the weaknesses, main weakness being the toughness and the fact you've got no EDR and no skill haste either. I will show you very quickly before I go just the character sheet so you can see how things are stacked. Crit damage is at 144. Damage to elites is at 40% with those purple mods, and enemy armor damage is at 35.5%. Skill haste, you can see 0%. Survivability, so my health is just over 200,000. Armor's probably about 400 off what it could be, and that's mainly down to the knee pads being rubbish. And there you go, my all damage resilience is at minus 10% because of reckless. But on the plus side, I've got a good bleed resistance. That's pretty much the only good thing about it from a survivability point of view. But this is a pure damage build. You're going to be as squishy as hell, but it is quite fun. So I do recommend trying it out if you want to build a DeadEYE build. But that's it for me. Thanks very much again for watching. If you liked the video, if you found any of it helpful, please do drop me a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.